Our final presenter for today is attorney Kevin Urbatsch, who will be talking about changes in public benefits. We will hoping that Kevin, will help families understand how to prepare for the recent updates to public benefits. Please give a warm welcome to Kevin Urbatsch.
Thank you, Alyssa. This is Kevin Urbatsch. I'm an attorney in Berkeley, California. I've spent about 30 years as a special needs planning attorney, serve as national director of the Academy of Special Needs Planners, a national group of attorneys who specialize in this area. Um, there it is. Okay. Why don't we move to the next slide there? So today I'm going to talk about public benefits. It's a real challenging subject for pretty much everyone. Even our federal judges, when they start looking at the rules and regulations, they talk about it in terms of the regulations written as an assault on the English language. The problem is that it's very complicated and it's things that change frequently. So the importance, though, for many of the clients who we serve, persons with special needs and their loved ones, is ensuring that we get access to those public benefits that the person's entitled to and maintaining that access even after maybe a parent is gone and they're leaving money as an inheritance to that loved one. We want to make sure that these public benefits are available. And the reason we're always doing this is because it's always a challenge to pay for the ongoing supports and care that a person with a disability needs. And when we're talking about public benefits in this arena, it's always a kind of concern for us that we have enough resources to care for them because of their inability to work, which is a lot of times either because they have a mental or physical impairment or because it's just too challenging to find work that can pay them a living wage. So it's important that we get as many sources of revenue and care that we can from these public benefit programs. Let's go to the next slide. So there's a quick, lovely logos of all of our public benefits. But if we go to the next slide, it'll give you a snapshot of the essential public benefit programs for persons with disabilities. We're going to spend a little bit of time on supplemental security income in this session. There have been some changes, mostly favorable up to now. We'll talk about Medi-Cal, also some changes, not as favorable. There's a subset of Medi-Cal called Magi Medi-Cal, which is not only fun to say, but it's a little easier to receive it and have it eligible, be eligible for it and keep that eligibility. But we'll talk briefly about that. IHSS, or in-home supportive services, frankly, is a Medi-Cal funded program. So if you qualify for Medi-Cal and then you qualify for IHSS, you can receive that program. And it provides in-home caregiving for those people who need that. We characterize those as needs-based public benefits, which generally means that that person who receives that benefit not only qualifies for it, usually as a person with a disability, but also financially qualifies for it, typically being poor. Entitlement public benefits are a little different. These are benefits that somebody has worked to receive. So, for example, Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI, is a program that as you earn wages, you're paying into the system and you're really buying the government's disability insurance policy so that if you become disabled under the rules, then you'll receive that payment for that, policy regardless of how much money you have. So very wealthy people can have SSDI. Childhood disabled beneficiary benefits, or CDB benefits. It used to be called DAC, or disabled adult child, which frankly I like better, but they changed the name to this CDB benefit. It's a really essential benefit for many of our clients. And a lot of times families don't know it's available. And one thing you realize pretty quickly in the public benefits world is a lot of these agencies don't go out of their way to inform you if things change and whether you can qualify for a new program. So CDB benefits we'll talk briefly about because I see that missed most common with clients that I meet with. Medicare is, again, the federally funded healthcare program. Some clients are surprised to learn that not everybody gets Medicare. You do have to pay into the system to qualify for Medicare or qualify for one of these other benefits, Social Security Disability or CDB, to obtain it. I have many clients who will never qualify for Medicare. And so they'll be basically dependent on Medi-Cal for the rest of their life. Then there's a host of other benefits that we have in California, including regional centers. Um, I heard briefly a Section 8 discussion earlier. I'll talk a little bit about that because there's been some changes to that program. Veteran benefits and CalFresh. I won't talk about veteran benefits in this session. We just don't have enough time for one. And then I'll briefly mention, a benefit with CalFresh. So if we can go skip the next slide and go to the slide after. So when we're talking about supplemental security income or SSI, as I mentioned, it's a needs-based benefit. It's a type of program that you have to meet the definition of disability, but you also have to be poor. And they define poor as you have to meet a certain resource test and you have to meet an income test. We'll talk in a little detail on the income test and resource test, but understand that when we're talking income for any of these programs, each agency defines the word income differently. I think most Americans associate income with what the IRS calls income, but that would be a mistake when you're looking at public benefit programs because a lot of these programs define income differently, and things that we might not think of as income become income under those programs. So if we go to the next slide. So how do we define disability? Well, this is the federal definition, and this definition applies to both SSI and SSDI. And basically, it's a physical or mental impairment that will last for 12 months or longer, or lead to, a pretty close death within a year, but prevents that person because of that physical or mental impairment from going out and engaging in what they call substantial gainful activity, which is a fancy way of saying because of their disability, they can't go out and work and earn in this year $1,620 a month doing anything. Okay. So it doesn't mean, well, they could work, but there's no jobs. That's immaterial to this definition. It's can they work because despite their disability and earn this much money doing anything in their community. If they cannot, then they meet the definition of disability for an adult in the United States to qualify for SSI or SSDI. Let's go to the next slide. So, what do you receive when you have SSI? If you qualify as a person with a disability and you meet the poor test, then basically what you get is in California $1,206.94 as an individual. It's $967 from the federal government, and California supplements that with the balance. So this is the award for SSI. If we go to the next slide, a big benefit to that award is even if you remain eligible for $1, you automatically receive Medi-Cal. So once you meet that SSI rules, you have SSI, you have Medi-Cal, which might lead to IHSS or in-home supportive services. So you can see how SSI is kind of a gateway into these other programs. If we go to the next slide. So what is that resource test? This is the most challenging test to meet. And that's because it's $2,000. If an individual has more than $2,000, then they're disqualified from SSI. And I will tell you that number has not changed since 1984. There's no index for inflation. There's been multiple attempts to kind of increase that to a more reasonable rate. But so far, it's always met with, disaster. Nobody will agree to make that change. So we are stuck with this $2,000 countable resource test. If we go to the next slide. But not everything counts. So for example, the big one is if they have a primary residence that they own, that primary residence is exempt. It's also true if they have one vehicle they use for transportation, no matter the value, it's exempt. There are also a host of other exempt resources like home furnishings, personal effects. They have some weird ones like life insurance, but a cash value of only up to $1,500. So there's other things that don't count, but these are the two big ones. Obviously, any kind of cash or valuable resources that are used, as collectibles, oftentimes those will be a countable resource. And if it's over 2,000, you don't get SSI, period. That's it. And we go to the next slide. Resources are easy, right? Anything over 2,000, you're disqualified. Income is much more challenging. And they count four different types of income. One is earned income, which is kind of what we think of when we think of income. That's what the IRS calls income. They go out, they get a job, they earn a wage. But what this one also has is something called unearned income. Social Security will count things like if you give a person with a disability $100 as just a gift. They count that as unearned income. And we'll see how that impacts that SSI check. Then they have this thing called in-kind support and maintenance, or we call it ISM. And that's if you give somebody, it used to be food, clothing, or shelter. And we'll talk about some changes to what ISM income means today, because it's changed from this year as from last year. And then the final type of income is called deemed income. Deemed income is why a lot of families, when they come to see me, they don't understand why their child would not qualify for SSI. And that's because as long as they're a minor, the parents' income and resources count against them. Once they're 18, they will just look to the minor's income and resources, which is why at age 18, a lot of people will qualify for SSI. If we go to the next slide. Now, much like there are resource exclusions, remember you can house of any value, car of any value, there are some SSI income exclusions, not nearly as valuable. The first one is any $20 of other income won't count. The big generous $20 any income exclusion. And the first $65 they earn is also exempt. That's pretty much it. They say we show food stamps on here. There's a few other things that are exempt, but these are the ones that we use the most frequently. It's a $20 or 65. So we go to the next slide. So this is where what is SSI earned income? As I mentioned, these are things like wages. You go out and you work. Sometimes I do get questions from family, like a loved one with special needs might be an artist and they sell their artwork, but if they receive money from that, that is earned income. So you have to be careful with that. If you go to the next slide, this is the impact of earned income on the SSI check. Now remember, California, an individual, they can receive $1,206.94 a month. But let's say that person can work and maybe not be able to get substantial gainful activity type work, but they can work at some job and earn a little bit of money. For every $2 they earn, they lose $1 from that SSI check. Okay. Now remember, we got to exclude the big $85, the 65 earned income and the $20 any income exclusion. So you can see here, if the SSI recipient goes out, they do some work, they get $585 in 1 month. We knock off the first 85 bucks and then they take $250 off the SSI check. Now understand that this is the default rule. Because Social Security and society in general wants to encourage work, they do have other programs that kind of opt you out of that kind of harsh default rule. And if you look at the SSA Red Book, you can see how you can reduce work against your SSI check with impairment related work expenses, a host of other past programs. There's all kinds of programs available. So if we go to the next slide, this is the tricky one. This is the really deadly type of income for an SSI recipient. That's if somebody gives gifts, they get dividends or interest, annuities, rental income, all these things count as unearned income. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the impact that unearned income has against an individual's check. So basically, you get your $20 any income exclusion, but then it's a dollar for dollar reduction. And I see this missed a lot because this applies to parents leaving their, handing their children a monthly allowance, not thinking there's anything wrong with that. But if Social Security finds out you're doing that and the person's on SSI, it's a dollar for dollar reduction on their check after the first 20 bucks. And that can be a big problem, especially if Social Security doesn't catch it for 5 or 6 years. They'll come back and want an overpayment and they'll want their money back. Okay. And the same thing applies after you're gone, a special needs trust. That's why special needs trusts that we work with oftentimes can't give cash to the recipient, the beneficiary, because if they do, it counts as SSI unearned income. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. This is the tricky one, in-kind support and maintenance. Now, historically, it included the payment of food, clothing, or shelter to an SSI recipient. So Social Security kind of felt, hey, if somebody else is going to give this person food, clothing, or shelter, then why should we continue to pay them this, incredible bonus of 1206.94 a month? Because that's what it's really designed for, is to give these people with disabilities enough money to pay for their food, clothing, and shelter, which again, we all know is a ridiculously low amount for that. But they have taken clothing off the list back in 2005. So you can now give somebody who's an SSI recipient a jacket without it counting against them. Last year, they removed food from that list too. So now you can give food, groceries, take them to a restaurant meal. None of that counts as in-kind support and maintenance. And they also define shelter. So you can see on this slide, there's a list of what they count as shelter. You'll see there's some things not on there, like, internet service, cable, stuff like that, that we might think of as utilities, but that doesn't count. So you can pay for that, no problem. But if you pay for any of these utilities, that counts as in-kind support and maintenance. And there's a change also with rent. We'll talk about in just a second. So if we go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, clothing was removed in 05. Food was removed effective October 1st, 1 year ago, almost to the day. And then shelter, utilities still count, but rent has a new rule. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, well, this is talking about the impact. Let's go here first. So what happens if somebody receives in-kind support and maintenance? So remember how with earned income, every $2 you earn, you lose a dollar of SSI from that 1206.94 check. If you get unearned income, you lose a dollar for dollar. There's no benefit really to unearned income. ISM income treats it differently. And basically what they do is they take the federal portion of the check. Remember that 967 of the 1206 is federally funded part of the check. And they count 1/3 off that. And so if the person lives in the home of the SSI recipient, like just think parent to child, and they let them live there rent free and utility free, they're going to reduce the check by 322. $322. That's 1/3 of 967. But let's say the person doesn't live with that person. And like, so for example, a special needs trustee pays the rent, utilities of the beneficiary who's living in an apartment. They reduce it by the 322, but then they add back in that 20 bucks. So they call that the presumed maximum value, 342. So you basically, if they live somewhere else and you pay their rent and utilities, it reduces the check by 342. If they live with you, it reduces the check by 322. These numbers change every year. The 1206.94, there'll be a cost of living adjustment. And then same with the presumed maximum value. And then the first one where you live with the person, they call the value of the 1/3 reduction rule. These are a lot of weighty names for a basic concept of how do we reduce the SSI check by somebody giving an SSI recipient, you paying for their utilities or rent. So this is the impact. If we go to the next slide. So this, as I mentioned before, they took food off the list. It used to be if you gave them food, it would reduce the check by the same way. But here's the cool thing about rent. It's always been a challenge in California because the person was supposed to pay their fair market value of the rent out of their SSI check, or they would have to have that reduction if somebody else paid. So they could, let's say they paid $700, but the rent was 1,000, and that was their share of the rent. If they didn't cover that full 1,000, they would trigger that ISM, in-kind support maintenance penalty, and they'd lose $340 off their check. The new rule, as of October 1st of last year, is that as long as they pay that presumed maximum value amount, remember the 342 something? So if they pay 343 a month from the SSI check and somebody else pays the balance, there's no ISM. So they don't have to pay fair market rent anymore. They only have to pay the 343. What's the difference? An extra 4,000 plus a year. And again, when we're looking for resources to assist people with disabilities, this is a great way to have the government pay a little more money. And even if it's to the parent, I recommend just taking the 343, even if you don't think you need it, and maybe setting it aside in an account that can grow over time that you leave to that child after you're gone as part of your estate plan. So again, this is good news, right? They've taken food off the list, and now all they have to pay is a 343 a month in rent, and it doesn't trigger ISM, in-kind support and maintenance. The other thing is you have to enter into what they call a business arrangement, which is a fancy way of saying you need a lease agreement that says you're covering 343, or probably want to say the PMV amount plus $1 each year. Anyway, this is a really nice way to get around that rule. And then there's again the utilities is still an issue. I still think they have to pay utilities through their SSI check. Otherwise, it might trigger that ISM, except, again, I'm getting a little far afield here, but if they do have an ABLE account and they qualify for ABLE, and a parent or a special needs trust trustee funds that ABLE account with, money, they can use the ABLE account to pay the utilities, and there's, again, no ISM. So there's some really good ways of circumventing legally these rules to make sure that the person with a disability is getting their full check. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this next slide is talking about deemed income. If you remember, I mentioned before that a lot of times parents come to me when their children are still minors and they don't understand their children's very disabled. They definitely meet the definition of disability. They'll never be able to work. They don't understand why they don't qualify for SSI. It's because mom and dad have too much money and their income and assets are counted towards that minor child. And at that point, that they turn 18, they stop looking at mom and dad's assets and start looking at the minor recipients. Also understand that if they have a spouse's income and resources count against that person, which is why it's always a challenge when an SSI recipient wants to get married. We have to always consider what the spouse brings to the table. If they have too much income and resources, it will count against them too. Even if they're both SSI recipients, remember the resource test is 2,000 for an individual. You think for a couple it would be 4,000, but no, they give you a marriage penalty. It's only 3,000. And the same with the check. They don't give you a double check. They give you an amount that's not quite double, like 1.5% of a two-person check. So understand there is a marriage penalty with SSI. And it doesn't matter if, say, the spouse refuses to pay for that person. It's, basically if they have money and they have income, it will count against them. Okay. So what did we talk about? We talked about a resource test of $2,000 for an individual, 3,000 for a couple. We have an income test that counts earned income. Remember, if they earn income, every $2 earned takes $1 off their SSI. Unearned income, they get a gift or an inheritance that's not planned for. It's $1 for dollar reduction off their SSI check. if somebody helps them with rent and utilities. If you're not following the rules, it could cost them up to $342 a month off their check for in-kind support and maintenance, or ISM. And then finally, the deemed income. So you can see how these rules are different, um, basically, than IRS rules. So if we go to the next slide, this is, I'm sure, hopefully you guys are all aware of this by now, but there's a really great way. A lot of times when families come to me, they don't know the difference between what benefits their loved one with special needs receives. Are they getting SSI, or maybe they're getting SSDI? And we'll talk about that in a second. They could be qualified for CDB, Childhood Disabled Beneficiary Benefits, and they just don't know. And the reason it's important for us as planners is because the rules are completely different. So the Social Security Administration did us no favors by naming one program SSI, another program SSDI, because they made the rules for eligibility completely different. So here, if you go to the My Social Security account, you open up that account. Basically, if you go to the next slide, one of the resources that you can obtain is a benefits letter, and it tells you exactly what benefits that person receives. And it's possible that somebody could qualify for both SSI and SSDI. I understand that because SSDI, if they qualify for that, counts as unearned income, right, against the SSI. So there's a dollar for dollar reduction. But if the SSDI check is only $500, they'll only count $480 against the SSI check. Therefore, they could still have, six, $700 of SSI, and then so they get two checks. I keep saying checks. I don't think we do checks anymore. Most of it's direct deposit. So again, a really good service is at My Social Security. I would definitely get your loved one with special needs on there, especially if they're an adult, and find out which benefits they're receiving. If we go to the next slide and then go to the next one. And interesting, hopefully by now, everyone who has a loved one with SSI is aware you can now qualify for CalFresh, which is the California's version of the SNAP benefit, that provides food. Before 2019, you could not do so. So you can apply just through this website here. I have to say, it's one of the easiest programs. I was able to get my daughter, who has autism, we got her on it, in the car in a 5-minute, interview. It was the quickest benefit we ever were able to receive. I don't know if it's still that way, but if you go to the next slide, the benefit here is you do get another $292 a month for an individual to help pay for food. So again, a really nice add-on benefit. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about Social Security disability, should say insurance. If we go to the next slide, basically, remember how I said SSI and SSDI have different rules? Well, SSDI, they do not have an asset test or an income test. If you qualify as a person with a disability and you have paid into the system long enough, you'll qualify for SSDI. And the amount of the check is dependent on how much you paid in and how long you paid in. And then once you qualify for SSDI, if you're on it for 2 years, you'll then qualify for Medicare. And oftentimes, the primary wage earner, other people in the family can earn off that. So sometimes it's a spouse, surviving children, a widow or widower. As long as the primary wage earner, if they earn it and they have other family members who qualify, they can get money off of that primary wage earner's SSDI. If we go to the next slide. So you have to pay in sufficient quarters. And what they do is they, kind of figure out, like, there's so many quarters you can earn a year. It's usually like 4 quarters a year. If you earn enough and then you become disabled, you can qualify for this program. And you can see here how a spouse can qualify, a divorced spouse can qualify, or a child can qualify. And the last one we'll look at is CDB benefits, which we'll talk about in just a second. If we go to the next slide, and this is where they can qualify for Medicare. And oftentimes we like Medicare because the person can qualify for Medicare and Medi-Cal, which is really the best healthcare that the government system can provide. And there are certain things that Medicare does better because sometimes it has more doctors, more facilities, more people will accept it. Um, there are things that Medicare doesn't do well, which is long-term service and supports like skilled nursing, or in-home caregiving, which we still need Medi-Cal for. So a lot of times we want them to be qualified for Medicare and Medi-Cal, which is oftentimes what we're planning on doing as far as special needs planners. But if we go to the next slide, and the next one after that, this is the childhood disabled beneficiary benefit. You still might see some old crusty people like me talk about it as DAC or disabled adult child benefits. But they now call it childhood disability benefits. So basically, if your loved one with special needs is becomes disabled before age 22, a lot of our clients have developmental disabilities, that's not an issue. And their parents paid into the system, and that person, that loved one with special needs, is never able to engage in substantial gainful activity. So remember, that's like a number. If they can go out and earn a wage, I think 1620 is this year's SGA number, which again changes every year. And and they're unmarried, they can qualify for their parents' social security check. So if we go to the next slide, what they can receive is if the parent becomes disabled or they retire, they can get 50% of what the parent receives. And it doesn't take away from the parent, it's in addition. So say the parent receives 3,000, $800, then the CDB recipient gets 50%. Now remember, that counts as unearned income against their SSI, but who cares? Because they're getting more money, right? And remember, we can't screw this up. So if they're a SSDI recipient, they don't have in-kind support and maintenance. So we don't care if someone helps with the rent or the utilities. It can't impact this check. The other benefit of this is if they're qualified for 2 years, they can also get Medicare. So and then if when the parent dies, they can get 75% of what that parent receives. So that's a pretty cool benefit. But remember, the challenging part is that person who became disabled before age 22 can never have engaged in substantial gainful activity and has to be unmarried. Those are two tricky things to tell loved ones with special needs when they're turning 18. you know, do you want to work? Do you want to be married? It may end up costing them this benefit. So it was a challenge for my family when we were talking about this with our daughter. But she was able to work, and we encouraged that. So she would not qualify for this program, but many people do. And what comes when I talk to people in my office, one of the first questions we ask is, are you retired and have you applied for CDB benefits? A lot of times they didn't realize they were qualified, and the person could have been receiving a much higher check for 5 to 10 years, plus qualify for Medicare. So understand that a lot of these programs out there are not advertising these benefits. So let's go to the next slide and the next one. So here's where we are on Medi-Cal. Um, it's a really wonderful program. If you look at other states' Medicaid programs, it is probably one of the better run in the country. Um, and basically what we have are a whole bunch of different programs of Medi-Cal for people with disabilities. It's kind of hard to talk about Medi-Cal in like, the aggregate because there's so many different doors to qualify for Medi-Cal. A lot of people on this call might have regional center benefits, and they might have a child with Medi-Cal through a waiver program called institutional deeming. And what that does is normally they do count mom and dad's income and resources as that person, so they disqualify them from Medi-Cal. But If they're a regional center client, then they'll institute institutional deeming, which means we don't count mom and dad's income and resources. So if we go to the next slide, this is a lovely little chart that talks about some of the primary programs that you can qualify for Medi-Cal. So the first one, categorical eligibility. Remember at the beginning when I said with SSI, you qualify for $1, you automatically get Medi-Cal? That's categorical eligibility. And so to qualify, you just qualify for the SSI rules, $2,000 resource, and your income stays very low. Magi Medi-Cal has never had an asset test and never will. Well, let me rephrase, and doesn't now. Who knows what they're going to change the rules? But right now, there's no asset test, and there never will be. But they look at income, and it's 138% of the federal poverty limit. Now it says on this chart that that number is 1799.75, and that's accurate. But our state Medi-Cal agency, the Department of Healthcare Services, came out with a policy that 1801 is the number, 1,801. So if you have less than 138% or 1,801 in today's world, then you could qualify for Magi Medi-Cal. They don't care if you're disabled. They don't care. You just can't have other health insurance like Medicare. But as long as you're between, your ages 19 to 65, 18 to 65, I should say, between those ages, then you can qualify for Magi. But if you're disabled, a lot of people end up with federal poverty level program. And that basically is, again, qualifying under the income test, but you're also disabled. You have to meet that requirement of disability. If you have too much income, then you'd qualify for medically needy Medi-Cal. A lot of times we call it share of cost, meaning that if you have too much income to qualify, you might end up having to pay some of your income towards your medical bills before Medi-Cal will pick them up. And then there's long-term Medi-Cal, which is basically if you need to go into a nursing home or a nursing home level of care, you can qualify for that program. And there's actually a 250% working disabled program. So again, it's 250% of the federal poverty limit, which is 3,138 this year. And they can earn up to that and still qualify for Medi-Cal. Now, remember that for categorical eligibility, there's a $2,000 resource test. That's true today, tomorrow, next year. Magi Medi-Cal, no asset test. That's true yesterday, today, tomorrow, next year. But for the rest of these programs, there's no asset test this year. So if we go to I think the next slide, but beginning January 1st, 2026, they're going to reinstate an asset test for Medi-Cal eligibility for those other programs. And that asset test will be 130,000 for an individual. And then it's 65,000 for each additional family member. So they are bringing back an asset test, but the first 130,000 is exempt. Okay. Now, what does that mean? I mean, basically on January 1st, 2026, if the Medi-Cal recipient, and remember, it's only for the federal poverty level, medically needy, long-term care, and 250% working disabled, if they have more than 130,000, it's not like they're going to lose their Medi-Cal right away. It just means that when they do their annual redetermination to see if they still qualify, that's when they test assets. So if you do have assets over that amount, you're going to want to do something with them. That's usually where you consider a special needs trust, a spend down, an ABLE account. There's things you can do, but you have to be aware that that's happening. But if you're under that 130,000, it doesn't matter. Unless again, you're on SSI. That's a different test for a different program. But for any of these Medi-Cals, that's important. I also have heard from a couple of people that they were informed that Medi-Cal will then also seek payback while the person's still alive for services they paid. That's not true. The only time Medi-Cal has a right to go after an SSI recipient's assets is after they die, and if they leave a probate estate, they can go after the probate estate, meaning they have to go to court and say assert their claim, or if they have money in a first party special needs trust. Those are the only two times Medi-Cal can come back against that person. Okay. How are we on time? All right, let's go to the next slide. But those are the big changes. We have the SSI changes, removing food, a better rule on rent. Medi-Cal, the asset test is increasing. And then in-home supportive services, again, this is just a great program. I mention it here just because it's really the only place you can find government paid caregiving. And even a lot of private insurance does not provide in-home caregiving. And when we're looking at a lifetime of care for a special needs person, especially when mom and dad are no longer there to provide it for free, if they're doing that, then we are looking for assistance. And even though IHSS has its issues, it won't pay 24/7 for people who need it. The rates aren't super great. It does provide a lot of assistance. So remember, they have to qualify under one of those Medi-Cal categories to be able to qualify for IHSS. So to qualify, you have an asset test beginning January 1st, 2026. If we go to the next slide. And I think I just mentioned this. This is a very important benefit and why it's important. If you go to the next slide and then you skip to the next one, as I mentioned before, Medicare is the other program. Again, Medicare is not automatic. A lot of people get it when they turn 65, but only if they paid into the system or they are one of those family members of a primary wage earner and they qualify. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. Some things that Medicare does not cover, which we're usually trying to find other sources of revenue, long-term care, in-home care. That's why Medi-Cal is still very important. A lot of dental care is not covered. Eye exams, dentures, you can see the list there. So again, we're always trying to find other resources for those if we can at all help it. And then we get into the next section, which is Section 8 housing. And I appreciated Esther, who spoke briefly on that in the next slide or two, about Section 8 and what it covers. And basically, it is a program that is managed by federally by the Housing and Urban Development and locally by the Public Housing Assistance Programs. And okay, I need to get to the next slides here. There we go. One more. There we go. And basically, there's two kinds of programs. There's the tenant-based and there's project-based. And tenant-based is you get a voucher and you can take that voucher anywhere that Section 8 is accepted. And again, she mentioned very clearly how what you get, and that's you only 30% of your income is counted towards rent. And the benefit is the federal government pays the balance to the landlord, so they get their full rental check. And the person with a disability is only paying 30%. If they're getting 1206, there's probably some reductions off that. They're only having to pay like $300 a month. And in California, that's a real blessing. Um, or it could be a project based, and that's where the voucher, the Section 8 voucher is in only that project. If you leave that project, you lose your Section 8 voucher. With a tenant based, you can take your voucher with you and go anywhere around to do that. If you go to the next slide, historically, Section 8 has had no asset test. Well, they instituted an asset test in January 1st, 2024. So it's been around for about a year, has not yet even really been implemented because they're having a lot of challenges implementing it. But there's now a new $100,000 asset test. So again, what that means is if you have more than that, you don't qualify for Section 8. And Section 8 is one of those programs that was clearly described before as having waiting lists. So it's unlike IHSS in California or Medi-Cal or SSI. For those programs, if you qualify, you get that program. Section 8 is you can qualify, but you have to wait for a voucher to be available. There's only so many vouchers that are around. If you go to the next slide. So this is the inflation. So unlike, remember when I said SSI has a $2,000 resource test and it has not changed since 1984? Fortunately for us, HUD did put in an inflation kicker on this. So in 2025 or this year, the asset test has gone up to $103,200. Okay. So bonus. I mean, it gives us a little bit more money, and we also know the asset test will grow as time goes on. And so again, it's a better test, I think. Frankly, I think this is what SSI should be doing, but I don't set policy in Washington. If we go to the next slide, there again, like other programs, remember I was saying before, each program has their own definitions. They're similar, but they're always different. So they do have asset exemptions of personal property, assets less than 50,000, and a whole bunch of others. For my purposes, a lot of times we're trying to set up special needs trusts, and basically a trust that is irrevocable and not under the control of a family member is exempt, which is good because if we're trying to set that up, we set up a special needs trust. And when it says family member, that doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means. Um, in this circumstance, it means who's living in the residence with the Section 8 recipient. So you could be the parent, but not living with them, and you could be in charge of the trust. Okay. Real tricky stuff here. If we go to the next slide, now income is a challenge because any countable income raises rent by 30 cents, right? Every dollar of countable income raises the rent by 30%. So, for example, with that special needs trust, the assets inside there don't count because it's a resource exclusion. But if you make a distribution from that trust, let's say you just make let's say $1,000 distribution for rent, or that's not a bad example. Let's do $1,000 just for any service, not rent, just any service. If you make a distribution from the income earned inside the trust, they'll count $1,000 as Section 8 income, and they'll raise the rent by $300. So the person has to pay $300 more dollars out of their pocket in rent. But if you make a distribution of principal out of that trust, meaning the amount of money you put in and you just distribute that out, it doesn't count anything against income. This rule is crazy because we're pretty convinced that HUD does not know the distinction between trust principal and trust income. So we have a feeling that there'll be a lot of redeterminations where they ask you as a Section 8 recipient, did you receive any distributions of trust income? You have to be very careful when you answer that question and work with your trustee to make that declaration. Because if you say, yes, I received, over the year, I received $25,000 of trust distributions for all these variety of things, they'll count that as $25,000 of more income annually and divide that up, and you'll have an issue. Okay. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to finish with just a quick regional center. There's not a lot of really updates here. We heard the new form on the IPP, which I have to say was news to me, which was interesting. If we go to the next slide, the thing to remember about regional center is, again, you qualify for it, you receive it. And if you qualify for it for a developmental disabled person, it's, birth to death benefits. It's an entitlement. They don't care how much money that person has. And they're not supposed to count money in a special needs trust, although every once in a while, regional center will say something like that. And then we have to get involved and explain to them, no, the money in a special needs trust is, in addition to regional center services, it's not supposed to replace it. If we go to the next slide, hopefully everyone here is aware it's really for people with developmental disabilities. It doesn't count purely physical or purely mental illness, but if they're duly diagnosed, you can still qualify if they meet one of these other definitions. Again, this is kind of unique to California. Not any other state has anything like this. So it's a really critical, program. And I think it's a wonderful program. Again, it's better if you advocate for your services, or I'm sure people on this program that you've been listening to the last few days who can assist. We have benefits counselors we recommend to people when they're either trying to apply for regional center or trying to obtain services through the regional or paid services through the regional center program. So if we go to the next slide, I'll finish up here with um, this is a ever shifting landscape. Public benefits is a challenge, and this is what makes what we do special needs planning so unique because very few people want to delve into these rules. I'm sure you're probably sitting there listening to this right now going, this is crazy. These rules are insane. There's so much rules, there's so much technical jargon. And it's true. So it's really important that you stay up to date with the changes. I do have a newsletter I send out each year that talks about different changes to the programs, different services that might be available. It's my website's on the screen there, and you can just punch in your email and you can get your newsletter. I also have written a book called Administering the California Special Needs Trust that goes through all of these rules in detail, especially how to make distributions without impacting eligibility for public benefits. I have a new edition coming out in January 2026 because of all the changes in the rules. So if you're interested, it'll be available on Amazon or you can call my office. And I'm going to guess we have a couple of questions. I look over 44 of them. Um,
Yeah, oh, just 44. Nothing we're not used to, right? We'll just chip them right off. No, I think maybe we're going to try and answer maybe two or three questions, and I see there's talk of maybe asking you to come back for another event so that maybe more of these questions could be answered. But
yeah.
there's still some confusion, several questions about the presumed maximum value and
Okay.
whether, the rent and what do we do and how do we get the full amount?
Yeah. Let me just tell you real quick. The rule changed October 1st, 2024. That doesn't mean that every SSA eligibility worker is aware of that rule. I have cannot tell you the number of times I've had to get on the phone or basically hand the law to the regional center worker or to the family to say, send this to the regional center worker. So understand that that may be an issue you're going to run into. Again, it's all about, they don't get a lot of training. And right now they've gutted the Social Security staff, and a lot of the people who've been there for decades are now forced retirement and they're bringing in new, younger people with not a lot of experience. So get ready for a lot of bad information.
Mm,
So you remember it's advocacy. And so you just have to stick with it. And I will tell you, daughter, my wife does what I do. She does it in Michigan. I do it in California. We've been doing this for about 50, 60 years, and our daughter's on SSI, and we fight with SSA every month. And we know the rules cold, and we give them chapter and verse, and we fight them. So I sympathize. It's a very complicated, difficult area, but if you stick with it, the SSI program is valuable for a lifetime.
mm. Yeah, yeah. I'm kind of caught in that myself right now. Um,
So I just let
Go
me
ahead.
just so the PMV understand as long as the person pays through the presumed maximum value amount, which this year is I think 342 with some
Some
change.
change.
If you
Yeah.
pay, I just say 344, right? Just go over it. And they pay that from their SSI check, then someone else can pay the balance of the rent. And there's no reduction in their SSI check. Okay.
Right. Just getting SSA to understand that on the phone or in person is
Of
sometimes a
course.
challenge.
I
But
mean,
keep at it. Keep at it. Effective advocacy, right?
yeah.
Okay, a couple of questions about grandparents who may or may not be the legal guardian. And would the DAC, I'm going to call it DAC too because I got the gray hair and I'm with you. That benefit, can they still apply if they are the guardian, but maybe not legally the guardian?
Um, I mean, they'll work off the parents' work record. Um, and they're now grandparents,
Grandparents.
there's one way to get the grandparent work record to apply to the kid. And I think I'd have, yeah, here we are. Again, I look it up before I would rely on
Mm,
what I'm saying here,
okay.
but I think if the parent dies and the grandparent takes over, support and control, and I think you actually have to get legally named as the guardian, then maybe it can work off a grandparent's work record. But
Mm,
before you rush off and try to apply for that, I would ask you to look up the rules, contact an attorney, contact myself, somebody to look this up
yeah.
for you. But there is a way for a grandparent, but primarily no, it's parent to child.
Okay. And how about DAC for under 18 years old?
They do not qualify until after 18. So they might qualify for a different program. If a parent dies, it might be a surviving minor child. They might get a different benefit, but DAC doesn't apply until they're adults.
Okay. And then maybe just to leave it on Oh, there are so many questions. That marriage penalty that you were talking about,
The
and the
worst.
and
Yeah.
the other penalties, right? People are saying, isn't that discrimination against people with disabilities? And is there any movement to have that changed? And maybe we'll end on that.
I mean, there have been, I would, in the last 10 years, I've seen five major pieces of legislation trying to update SSI rules because they are, again, it was a big challenge to get it passed in 84, and they got this thing passed. But despite multiple attempts to update it, we just don't, there's just not enough people in Congress willing to step up. And I will tell you, under the current administration, I guarantee that's not happening.
Mm,
We're going to be dealing with, if hopefully if things change, maybe it won't be so bad. But if things don't change, we're dealing with massive reduction probably in that Magi Medi-Cal for sure,
mm,
and then Medi-Cal in general, which would probably trickle down to IHSS. So hopefully things change. They're not supposed to be implemented for a couple more years yet. So the short answer is no, I don't think there's anything on the horizon that's going to change that marriage penalty. And, write your congressman or
mm.
um, where it comes from is grassroots advocacy,
Yeah, grassroots for sure.
describing how unfair this is. And it is unfair. It's grossly unfair. And I just wrote an article about this for the family law attorneys about, all kinds of issues that come up when an SSI recipient divorces or becomes married.
Mm, yeah, yeah,
It's a
yeah.
challenge. I,
Back
I
marrying the back and all
sympathize.
that. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I didn't mean to end on a bit of a downer note, but hopefully you can come back and have more questions answered. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. We never do with Kevin. I mean, we know we never get to all the questions,
Yeah, I will
but
tell you that I do have a website, movingtomastery.com, and it does have a bunch of workshops. I mean, what I covered here in 50 minutes, I do 2 hours a year at my program. We go into a
yeah.
little more detail. I actually break them out sometimes, just do SSI for like working well on SSI is a different program. So these are, this is a 50-minute hello, how are you doing
Yeah,
introduction.
it was a tall order. It was a tall order. I knew when I asked you it was a tall order. But thank you so much for coming nonetheless. And we very much appreciate the information. There's still so much that we have to learn, and I appreciate you as the teacher. So thank you very
Anytime.
much, Kevin.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay.